everybody. Welcome back to our Virtual Connect series. Today we're going to be talking about the wild and wacky spring session of the Colorado General Assembly. It was one for the records and hopefully something we don't repeat anytime too soon, although we did have a lot of successes this year. So that's the order of the day, is to hear about AIA Colorado's 2020 advocacy success stories and our legislative session recap. As always with these sessions, you'll get one learning unit for attending today. We ask that you stick around to the end to get that full hour credit. And we hope that you can use the Q&A function for today's presentation. If you have questions or comments for our speakers, we'll get to those as we proceed. Just from my perspective, seeing the first session of the Colorado General Assembly as someone who works for AIA Colorado, it was interesting to say the least. Not just because of COVID though, there were a lot of things in the works even before that. And we were very active. In any legislative strategy, you need an offense and a defense. And we were active on both sides. You'll hear more about those in particular with the details. I do think it's incumbent upon us as an organization to not just react to what the legislature puts out there, but to be proactive as well. So the Government Affairs Committee, our lobbyists, our staff have all taken that to heart. And we've been very proactive on a number of fronts and been more active than years past in terms of the numbers of bills taking positions on, and even brought members of the Capitol to testify for. So that is the context and the backstory. And to share more about each of those points in greater detail, we have 5 presenters today. Welcome all of you. I will tell you who they are, and we'll go in alphabetical, if not presenter order. Starting with Doug Abernethy. Hi, Doug. Doug is joining us from sunny and socially distant after working in Nebraska, Montana, and New Mexico, Doug relocated to Colorado Springs to join RTA in 2002. His expertise as a principal is facilitating the design process with RTA's clients, where their goals and values are not only met, but exceeded. Welcome, Doug. Next, we have
Thank you.
Gossard. Hi, Brandon. Brandon is a project architect and associate at Architects. Over the past 15 years, as a city planner and an architect, working on both policies and projects to contribute to local communities. He's the chair this year of the Government Affairs Committee for AIA Colorado and a longtime active member of that group. Welcome, Brandon. And we have Jerry. Jerry is an honorary member of AIA Colorado, and he's represented architects at the state capitol since he was hired by AIA Colorado in 1982. Following an interview process conducted by Phil Giroux, D.A. Bertram, and Marvin Sparn. During that time, he has helped the organization great relationships with members of the General Assembly. And we thank you for all that great service, Jerry. Welcome.
Thanks, Mike.
We also have Caleb Tobin. Hi, Caleb. Caleb joins us as someone who's in the field, but also adjacent to it. He leverages his experience as an architect and lead accredited professional, counseling clients through commercial litigation and transactional matters, with an emphasis on construction, real estate, and eminent domain. Before joining the firm he's with now, Caleb was a project manager and senior architect at the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Welcome, Caleb. And finally, Nicholas Remus is a licensed architect and the Advocacy Engagement Director for AIA Colorado. Prior to joining us on staff, he spent 9 years working at CTA Architects and was an active member on the GAC. Welcome back, Nick.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, you've got a lot to share with us today. So we look forward to hearing what exactly went down at the Capitol this spring for AIA Colorado. Take it away.
All right. Well, looking at the attendees list that we have today, I see a lot of very familiar names. So most of you are going to be well aware of what exactly is the GAC and the Legislative Subcommittee. But for those that aren't familiar, the GAC is basically a volunteer committee of architects and people that are associated with AIA Colorado, whose real goal is to support and enhance the practice of architecture. And the way that we do that is by tracking legislation and policy at both the state and the local level to try and identify what types of impacts might architects see from a business, a licensure, or just overall practice standpoint. We're a pretty broad group, representative group of individuals, everyone from associate AIA members to FAIA members, production people to principals. It's a lot of different perspectives and people at different points in their career. And really the purpose of the group is to provide a more nuanced set of, or a more nuanced guidance to the AIA board on issues of state and local significance. And the way we go about that is to try and build champions on both sides of the aisle and really try and address whatever type of challenges that the state government, whatever happens, throws our way. So to give a kind of quick summary of this last legislative session, Nick will give us kind of a rundown.
Yeah, so I'm going to rattle off all the different categories that we look at every year. So the big three are professional licensing, since we are licensed by the state. The next is contracts, liability, and tort. And oftentimes this is related to construction defects, so we tend to use those different terms interchangeably, but what happens should we get sued for a project? And then the third big category is practice of architecture and firm management, the business side of things. But we also look at sustainability, climate change in the environment, capital construction funding, project delivery methods, qualifications-based selections. Construction trades and workforce development affects us a little bit, even though it's not direct. We look at community development and resiliency, transportation, affordable housing, historic preservation, codes and standards, and taxation in general. So there are a lot of different categories that we keep an eye out on. And this year, and I'm not going to go too far into the weeds, but we looked at 651 bills this year. That's how many bills were introduced in the session. I do a first pass at flagging bills that might be of interest to architects, whether or not they want to take a position or not. I found 65 House bills of potential interest and 51 Senate bills of potential interest. Of those, 16 House bills have been sent to the governor and 10 have been signed. 15 of those Senate bills have been sent to the governor and 6 have been signed. So those will all get included in my formal report when the governor has kind of done all of his bill signing. But ultimately, we took action on 8 bills, although only 7 of those were introduced. We'll go into one that was close to getting introduced, but not quite. So out of 651 bills that we have to look at, we targeted 8.
All right, so really we're going to break this out into kind of 2 different groups. The first group of 4 bills, these are bills that were impacted by coronavirus, and these are all bills that we engaged on, but there was no and to give us kind of a general overview of kind of the coronavirus impact specifically on the state budget, Jerry's going to walk us through that component before we get into the nitty-gritty of the individual bills.
Thank you, Brandon. First, I think I would be negligent if I didn't make the obvious point. Government affairs is a team effort, and AIA Colorado has one hell of a great team. So working with Mike and Nick at the central office, running the organization, getting their incredible day-to-day support is important. The work of the Government Affairs Committee is yeoman work, but I'll tell you, the folks who sign up to read every bill and meet every Tuesday morning to review those bills give us really great service. And then I've always said that AIA Colorado has among the very best volunteers of any organization that I am familiar with. So we use architects at the Capitol to testify on bills. You're going to hear about some of that today. But architects also open doors for us. They help us meet legislators early in their careers, and they help us build relationships with them. They make contributions to our PAC and our small donor fund, which helps us be successful in cultivating legislators. So with that overview, I would say an overarching theme this year for AIA Colorado was how often we relied on our friends whose friendship we built out of AIA relationships to help us fix bad bills and to help us kill bad bills and to help us pass great bills and be successful at the Capitol. So no one word can capture the stop-start 2020 legislative session. It was unorganized, unconventional, painful, chaotic, subdued, truncated. All those words come to mind. And to some extent, it was all of those things and more. As usual, the legislature convened in the first week in January, but then on March 14th, because of the impact of COVID-19, they hit the pause button and announced they would return on March 30th. March 14th was a Saturday, a rare Saturday session, so they could wrap up what they had to do in order to get out of town. And I turned out to be one of a handful of lobbyists at the Capitol on that day. But March 30th came and went, and eventually 10 weeks later, on March 12th, the legislature returned to the Capitol and then adjourned on Monday, the 15th of June. So only 3 weeks of this truncated session resulted in most of the legislation we're going to talk about today. They only worked 80 of the 120 days allowed by the Constitution. So when they returned for that 3-week period, because of COVID-19, the rules were very different. We saw social distancing, the use of masks, enhanced screening to get into the Capitol, with legislators scattered around the balconies of the House and the Senate so they wouldn't be too close to each other. A few legislators, because of health reasons, had to call in from home. The space behind the House and the Senate chambers was totally off limits to anyone except a legislator. And essentially, lobbyists were not allowed. Now, technically, we were, but the clear message was stay away and lobby from home or from your office. Lobbying was difficult. My experience was that emails were not working because legislators received hundreds and hundreds of emails from stay-at-home lobbyists every day, and most of them had a fact sheet attached. Text messaging, however, was kind of the new telephone call. And you could get a legislator to look at your email if you sent them a text first and said, I just sent you an email, the subject line says this, you need to take a look at it for this reason. 650 bills were introduced, as Nick pointed out, but only those who fit discrete categories were passed. And the term of art used at the Capitol was fast, friendly, and free, meaning that that if they didn't cost any money, if they were not contentious, and if the legislature could do it in a very short period of time, it was okay. Everything else, including some of the main priorities of the legislative session, were abandoned by the leadership of the House and the Senate. So the budget cut $3.3 billion from the state general fund portion of $13 billion. As part of the cuts, K through 12 education was cut by $621 million. Higher ed by $598 million. And a $225 million para supplemental payment was abandoned. So in addition to the budget, which included school finance, the legislature only considered orbital bills, i.e. those needed to facilitate the budget cuts. For example, if the statute said the legislature shall appropriate dollars for X, and they don't have the dollars to appropriate it, they also have to change the statute that authorizes the appropriation. Sunset bills were passed. Over 30, I believe, sunset bills this year that continue regulation of occupations and professions were under review this session. The COVID-19 help bills were passed. The legislature passed bills that included $70 million in federal relief monies to pay for mental health and substance abuse treatment occasioned by COVID-19, to make small business grants, to provide rent and mortgage assistance, and so forth. So with a $3.3 billion cut, the pain was broadly distributed, and many of the favorite programs funded by the JBC before COVID-19 had to be abandoned. In spite of that, as Mike mentioned, AIA Colorado had an excellent session, and we're excited to tell you about it today.
Well, to lead us off on the individual bill discussion, Caleb is going to talk about Senate Bill 93. This was Consumer and Employee Dispute Resolution Fairness.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, so this bill, the purpose of this bill was to enact a statutory framework called the Consumer and Employee Dispute Resolution Fairness Act. So the goal of this bill was to increase protections for two key groups: consumers and employees who are required to agree to an arbitration agreement. So first of all, what is arbitration and why do architects care about it? Probably most of us are relatively familiar with what arbitration is. It's essentially an alternative dispute resolution process. So in an agreement, you can agree to not go to court with the other party that you're in contract with and agree instead to go to arbitration, which essentially would have one or more arbitrators deciding your dispute, similar to how a court would, but differently. But it's viewed by some to be a less expensive and less timely, time-consuming method of dispute resolution. So why do architects care about it? Because if you were to look at almost any agreement that an architect may get into, that may be an employment contract, it may be a contract with a client, maybe a contract with a consultant, maybe the lease on the building that you're working out of. Many of those contracts have arbitration clauses, which again require that we arbitrate versus go to court. So that's why we care about it, because it's in a lot of the agreements that we sign. So what specifically was this bill trying to achieve? Well, essentially what it's trying to do is prevent partiality and unfair arbitration practices, which would be forced on a party with little or no bargaining power. So for instance, if you're an employee and you work for a firm that has 500 employees, chances are you're going to be negotiating your salary, but you're not going to be negotiating the arbitration clause in an employment agreement. And so what that means is a lot of times the employer can choose the arbitrator or have a lot of say over who that arbitrator is. So what this bill is trying to do is make it more fair for those individuals that don't have the same bargaining power. So specifically, this prohibits a waiver of standards for evident partiality. It establishes ethical standards for arbitrators, so they can't have conflicts of interest, for instance. It requires that the arbitrator make specific disclosures to the parties before it sign on to arbitrate the dispute. It assigns attorney's fees if you challenge the partiality of an arbitrator. and you challenge and you win that challenge, you'll get the fees that you've spent thus far. And also, it provides that the standard provides that for a standard form contract, specific terms are unenforceable. So if this term is in a contract, it may make either that portion of the term or the entire arbitration clause unenforceable. And these things are just clauses that are unfair. For instance, if you sign an arbitration agreement for an employer in Colorado and you work in Colorado and a claim comes up in Colorado, but the parent company is in New Jersey and they say you have to arbitrate the agreement in New Jersey, that's unfair. So clauses like that would not be enforceable. So why did the AIA oppose this bill? Well, they opposed it first, and then it was amended so that the AIA was actually neutral. And we aren't opposed to any of the things, most of the things that I just mentioned. We want impartiality, and we want the arbitration clause to be fair. But the AIA originally opposed it because there were some standards in the bill that were vague or too broad, and it treated arbitrator experience in certain areas, such as construction defects, as suspect, and it limited the standard contract terms, which AIA is generally against because we want arbitration clauses to be enforceable. So this is a good example of a bill that we did not oppose in its entirety, but we just opposed partially. And at the end, we were able to accomplish those goals.
So do you just want to jump in, Brandon? So this is a great example of something I mentioned earlier, relying on your friends and how your friends can help you at the Capitol. So we first heard about this bill from the House Majority Leader, Alec Garnett, when Nick and Mike and I went to visit with him to both introduce him to Mike and to talk about our major priorities for the session. And he said, you really ought to take a look at that arbitration bill that's starting over in the Senate. So that was the first we'd heard about it. And it was a very valuable heads up for us. So our goal, first of all, was to be part of the design construction coalition. And we all came in to testify against parts of the bill. And we identified certain problems that were problematic for architects. Nick laid those out when he testified in the bill on committee. And then the bill was not amended in committee and went to the floor. Mike Foote was the Senate sponsor of the bill. And so when I lobbied it, my strategy was to talk to those members of the Senate in Mike Foote's caucus who would say to him, Mike, I think this is a great bill, but you know, there are these problems with it. And he heard that enough from about 6 Democrats who we work most closely with that eventually he came around to offering up the amendment that included the items that Nick Remus talked about in his testimony.
Thanks, Jerry. So we're going to move on and try and move through these a little bit quicker, just so that we can wrap this up within the time that we have. To talk about House Bill 1348, we'll have Caleb discuss this again for additional liability under Respondent Superior, which I'm sure I did not pronounce that correctly.
Yep, so, some say respondeat superior or superior. It just depends. It's one of those terms that you really don't want to know about unless you have to. Essentially, what is respondeat superior? It's when an employer is liable for something that its employee does because the employee is doing that thing within the context of its employment. So the typical example is if you're a truck driver and you're driving your car to work that morning and you hit somebody, you're liable. If you're driving your truck and making a delivery and you hit somebody, you are liable and your employer is liable. So your employer is typically going to be on the hook because they have more money. So something happened in 2017. The Colorado Supreme Court said that if someone brings a claim for that, respondeat superior, you are liable only for that. And the claimant cannot also bring a claim for negligent hiring, which means if you're hiring a truck driver and that truck driver had 3 DWIs or was in 5 accidents in the last few years, then you're also negligent for that hiring, for that job. So what this bill does is it tries to reverse that. So you can now be liable again for both. You can be liable for the negligence of the act itself, and you can be negligent in your hiring or training practices. And why do we not like this? Because it's more claims, plain and simple. And that's really the nuts and bolts of that one.
So our strategy on this bill, because it was introduced very late in the process and had not been heard in any committee when the legislature hit the pause button, our strategy was to try to convince the House and Senate leadership not to put this bill on the agenda when the legislature came back for the final 3 weeks. And so Mike and Nick drafted a letter to the majority leadership and the minority leadership of both houses, and it basically said, please do not consider this when you return to the Capitol. And as it turned out, that's exactly what happened. However, I fully believe we will see this bill come back next session. The driving force behind it is Chris Kennedy, Representative Kennedy from Lakewood, and the motivation for the bill was that terrible truck accident on I-70, the runaway truck that came down the mountain, and I think it was driven by a driver with a Texas firm, as I recall, trucking firm, and so that was the catalyst for the trial lawyers approaching Representative Kennedy, who is, by the way, the odds-on favorite to be the majority leader next session when Alec Garnett becomes the Speaker of the House. Thank you.
So at this point, we'll move on to the next Senate bill. In this case, it is Senate Bill 23. This was the global warming potential for public project materials.
Oh, sorry, it's 159, Brandon.
159? Oh.
Yep, that was my typo, sorry.
And this is something that Nick and I will briefly touch on. This was a bill introduced by Senator Chris Hansen, who has also authored a series of different energy efficiency and climate change bills. And because this directly looked at building materials and it required certain levels of reporting, we were definitely interested in how this bill moved forward because it does directly affect the built environment. Functionally, it would establish kind of a state level maximum acceptable global warming potential for very specific building materials. The bill went on to curate a very specific list of those building materials that would be incorporated into this first effort. It was not an exhaustive list, and that's actually part of how we ended up getting engaged in it. And really, once you actually got to construction, contractors would be required to submit product environmental declarations that kind of outlined the final selection of the global warming potential. And the idea being that this would end up being a way of helping to ratchet down the built environment's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And because of its potential alignment with AIA's climate reduction goals, or climate change addressing goals, excuse me, this was one that we definitely wanted to engage in.
Yeah, I'll chime in real quick to say that, we did look at other materials to add, but we got some pushback on that from various groups. So we didn't want to sink the bill by going too far too soon. The whole goal of the bill is to get the state and contractors and architects more comfortable with the process for tracking embodied carbon. And there ultimately aren't that many state-owned projects compared to privately funded projects in the state, but it's a good way for the state to make a statement. And we do hope this bill will return in some form in an upcoming session.
So our part of our strategy is tied to the sponsor on this bill. Again, Chris Hansen is one of our targets as a future champion of architects, a designation we launched a number of years ago. And we always try to have 3 or 4 members of the legislature who have that designation and can be our go-to friends at the state capitol. In the Senate right now, the Senate President, Leroy Garcia, is one of those champions of architects. So on this bill, as Nick said, we would have ideally liked to have a couple of products added to it, foam insulation and drywall, as I recall. But discretion was the better part of valor in this area, and we hope to be able to work on this bill with Senator Hansen in the future.
The last bill that we're going to talk about in kind of this initial wave of bills is actually one that was destined to be a House bill, but didn't quite get there. This was the building energy benchmarking, and Nick's going to walk us through that.
Yeah, so if you live in Denver or Boulder or Fort Collins, you may already be familiar with building energy benchmarking mandates. The idea is for buildings that meet certain criteria to go through the Energy Star portfolio manager program annually. So the building owners report the energy use to that program, and then it gets added to the database and is publicly available to anyone who wants to check out the Energy Star website. So this would take that bill and apply it statewide. Not all buildings. The target was going to be commercial buildings over 50,000 square feet out of the gate. So the thought was that that's not going to be too onerous for building owners for buildings of those sizes, and not too onerous for the state to enforce the requirement that buildings do this reporting. So that is one part of it. The other part of the bill that's not entirely unprecedented, but very new, is that starting in 2029, or at least as the bill was originally envisioned, existing buildings, certain existing buildings may have to meet minimum performance requirement standards even higher than when they were designed and constructed. So that may sound a little scary, and the bill sponsors kind of knew that this is something that already exists in New York City to some extent, but we wanted to make sure when we were talking with sponsors that we didn't want architects to get in trouble for designing a building to code and seeing it be constructed, and then within the statute of repose where we could get sued, we didn't want those standards to go up, and then have the building owner with the building that would have to be improved and then turn around and sue us and the contractor and the engineers. So that was kind of our biggest concern. But we've had some good conversations on, what is the intent of that minimum performance requirement. We know the rules won't even start going to development until 2024 at the earliest. So there's a good understanding that this is a kind of a novel approach of taking an existing building that's not undergoing a renovation or an alteration and kind of raising the expectations for energy performance for that building over time. And so we had some good conversations with the Representative Kathy Kipp, but unfortunately, that was right before the pause in the legislative session.
So our strategy was to talk.
Yep. And, you know, we did have a good follow-up conversation during the gap in the legislative session. So we know that Representative Kipp wants to bring this back. And it sounds like she's got a lot of potential co-sponsors interested. So this has, from our understanding, pretty good Democratic support. So we're going to continue to engage in that stakeholder process.
Well, that wraps up kind of this first cohort of bills. You know, these are all the ones that got stalled out due to COVID-19. And to kind of wrap this up, Jerry's going to talk a little bit about what bills we predict will return in the next legislative session, which will hopefully be more normal.
So are you talking about the session we just completed, the section?
Right. So basically this most recent ones that stalled out, which ones we predict will be returned.
Okay. So I think potentially all of them. The one we really don't know about is 93, which is the arbitration bill, because the sponsor did not run for re-election. And I think Mike Foote was the kind of passionate champion of that bill, but the majority leader of the Senate was also on it. So I would certainly anticipate that it will be coming back. I think that our job in the interim is to talk to the leadership about reintroducing the bill as amended by Mike Foote and not make us start all over again by holding off the portion of the bill that's difficult. But I think that 1348, the Respondeat Superior bill, 159, the global warming materials bill, and the Kathy Kipp benchmarking bill that we don't have a number for, I expect all those to be back.
Thanks, Jerry. So those were all the ones that we're kind of holding our breath on. The next group of bills are ones that we consider kind of wins for AIA Colorado. And to lead that off is actually going to be Senate Bill 23. And Doug's going to walk us through the Colorado Working Group on School Safety.
Thank you. So I think the description is pretty accurate. So the legislature created this working committee and didn't make any action beyond creating this working committee, which I understand, Nick, does it have a sunset portion to that or not?
Yeah, it's not going to be meeting in perpetuity.
Right. So it's got a sunset. But what was interesting, I think, from AIA's perspective is it did not include an architect as a representative to that group. And so it was a mixture of school administrators, law enforcement, representatives that were part of that. Nick, were there other key components beyond that? There was some discussion, and we'll talk a little bit about fire and life safety here. But
yeah, those were certainly part of it. Mental health was definitely a consideration, and that was being represented through various executive branch agencies.
Right, and so the omission that was identified was the lack of representation by an architect, and so the state's office of the state's architect was really the push by the AIA in order to get that inclusion. And so myself and Paul Hutton were contacted through Nick to go and lobby on the Capitol. And so we went up and we actually talked for several times on the phone. I think we had maybe 10 days or so, Nick, before we went up.
Yeah.
And so there was a couple of conversations between Paul Hutton at Cunningham, and I on what we were going to cover, which was most important, what key things that both Jerry and Nick indicated that we needed to cover, why an architect would be valuable on this committee, and there'd be a representative from the architecture community on this. And so Paul and I sort of divided and conquered as far as on strategies, both around code-related items and then also the expertise that architects can bring related to the design of schools across the state that would help influence that group. And so that was the key component. One of the other things to keep in mind when you get the chance to go up and speak at the Capitol is there is a different level of energy when it's in session, and there's a certain level of chaos and members moving in and out of committee depending on what the priorities are going on. And so you have to sort of be comfortable with a little bit of that chaos going on. And as most people know, these things are recorded. And so as you practice your written word on that, you want to make sure that you follow through and deliver all of that, because it will become part of the record with the state. And that's always a good thing for those members that are not there, that they see some of that hopefully when that is under discussion, or when Jerry or Nick start to talk to those members.
Great. Well, Doug did a great job along with Paul testifying on this bill. Our strategy was to amend the bill, and then, as it turned out, to fight like hell to hold that amendment in the bill. So as soon as Mike and Nick signaled to me that they thought this was a bill that could use architectural input, I went to the sponsors of the bill, who turned out to be longtime friends, Daphne Michelson Janae in the House. Her co-prime was Kevin Van Winkle, and in the Senate, principally Senator Bob Gardner from Doug's part of the state in Colorado Springs. And I said to them, we would like you to support an amendment from AIA to add an architect to the working group. Senator Gardner actually came up with the idea of adding the state architect or her designee as that member, because it would be consistent with other categories of membership in the bill. So they agreed to it. Paul and Doug testified on it. The committee added it and held off several other amendments, but there were a couple of Senate amendments added as well. And then COVID hit. So in early February, we had this bill all wrapped up with a bow on it, ready to tell our members, oh, we have a great victory here. And then the legislature came back into session for the final 3 weeks. And as it turned out, there was a little mischief being played here. We had heard early on from a couple of department heads, or department lobbyists, liaisons, they call them, that they didn't like the idea of having an architect on the bill. And so it didn't fit their notion of the law enforcement angle or the fire protection angle. And we told them we were going to resist their opposition to that, but they never showed up in committee. And so what happened in the House, after the bill was debated in committee and went to the full floor of the House for action, I'm at home sitting on my computer, flipping back and forth between the House and the Senate, listening on the broadcast as well as watching it on television and trying to keep track of everything that's going on. The difficulty with that is that they print a calendar, but they never follow the calendar. And so the majority leader in the House and the Senate can call up a bill for action at any time. So if you're over in the Senate when the House is doing that and you're not following it, you're going to miss something. So as it turns out, the House adopted an amendment offered by a very good friend of mine who happens to be the governor's lobbyist, that replaced the architect on the bill with a person with fire experience in one of the departments. I did not see it. And the next day, the bill passed on third and final reading in the House. And I thought, great, we're going to have a great celebration here. But for whatever reason, I thought, I'll just check the bill one more time. And son of a gun, our amendment had been deleted on second reading. And so I went ballistic. I picked up the phone, I called my friend Daphne, and I said, I cannot say this in a public forum. What did you do? And she said, oh, Jerry, I forgot. You talked to me back in February. That was months ago. I totally forgot that I agreed to add an architect. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I have a text message that I shared with Nick in which he said, I am so sorry 7 times. But we developed a strategy to get the Senate to reject the House amendments and ask for a conference committee. So that's what happened. The bill went back to the Senate for concurrence, is what it's called, with the House amendments, and the Senate said, no, we want to go to conference. So each House appoints 3 members to a conference committee. We had it greased then with all the sponsors on board to put our member back in on top of the fire edition that the House originally adopted. So I guess all's well that ends well, but that's what happened on that bill. Thanks, Brandon.
And then one quick closing thought that I want to share with members. Safety has been an issue that's been important to AIA in recent years at the national level. So, they get some credit for helping the component level be aware of what their efforts are, what resources they have, so that as soon as I saw this bill, I knew that we had a good opportunity to get architect added because there was precedent for it, and we would have good resources to help convince legislators, which it turns out were largely unnecessary because the sponsor was very amenable to it. But credit to AIA National for supporting our efforts by looking at these issues and being a resource for us.
Let me add one other thing, Brandon, if I might. So I discovered something I didn't know. So the co-prime sponsor in the House, Kevin Van Winkle, who I mentioned, has been a friend of mine for a long time. I think I've done 3 fundraisers for him. His wife, Kelly, works with my daughter, Elizabeth, at Schwab. And only after all of this, he said to me, I love architects. My dad is an architect. I had no idea. Oh man, will we be using him in the future?
Well, sitting in more of a stark contrast to the more overt legislative maneuvering on the Colorado Working Group on School Safety, House Bill 1326 sought to create an occupational licensing portability program. And this was a good example where it was more about very specific, focused discussions and leveraging our relationships versus the more overt acts of, testifying and, reaching out individually while the bill is being debated that we just heard about. So really this occupational license portability program is something that architects we're familiar with the premise because the idea of reciprocity through NCARB, like this is something that we're used to. But one of the concerns that we had, because the idea that this bill would actually create a program where if you were licensed in another state, it would make it easier to get licensed in Colorado. And there was some potential languages in the bill that was identified that would actually, it could have inadvertently let people who were not qualified to be architects in Colorado, that they could actually port their licensure in via the state method that would be introduced with this new House bill. So naturally, we were particularly concerned with this because it directly could have influenced how we deal with reciprocity in the state. And Jerry can kind of walk you through the very specific but simple way that AIA Colorado approached it.
So this is another great example of why you need friends at the Capitol. So the sponsors of the bill are Shannon Bird and Kevin Van Winkle in the House, and Pete Lee and Bob Gardner in the Senate. During the last election cycle, we had a meeting at AIA to which we invited 4 legislators who were running for office to present to us about their campaign and allow architects in the room to talk about the kind of practice that they were engaged in and the kind of issues that we have at the Capitol. Included in that group were Senator Faith Winter, Representative Yadira Caraveo, Representative Kyle Mullica, and Representative Shannon Bird. Now, Shannon is a lawyer and is whip smart, and she loves architects. And so when she authored this bill, and Nick and Mike signaled the issue that you just described, Brandon, I picked up the phone and called Shannon, and her response was, "Don't worry, Jerry, I will fix this for the architects." And so we actually had a meeting out in the hallway at the rail by the House in which we agreed on the language. The drafter came up to that meeting. The advocate for the Department of Regulatory Agencies was there, and Nick and me, I can't remember if Mike was at that meeting or not, but we did the deal right there on the spot.
How we wish all bills would go.
All right. So looking at our time, it is now 12:53. We got 2 more bills to work through. The first one is the Interior Design Practice, House Bill 1165, and this will be Jerry and Nick.
Yes. So for those of you who are not intimately familiar with our Practice Act, we have an exemption. We have multiple exemptions, as do most states, for kinds of projects that do not require a licensed architect. And included in our particular Practice Act are some additional language that says certain interior designers can do projects as well. So there's kind of the must have an architect, which is most projects. Doesn't require an architect at all, but then there's kind of this little middle area where certain interior designers can do those projects. So this is right there in our Practice Act, and interior designers pointed out that some of the requirements to prove that they are a qualified interior designer were outdated. They just didn't make sense in kind of the paperwork that they would have to present to the building department to show that they met that exemption that already exists. So they crafted a bill to clean that up and modernize it. They contacted us before the bill was even introduced, which was great, so we could look at it. But we did find some language that troubled us because it dealt directly with life safety, which is, we consider our domain as licensed architects. And we felt like there was some language that probably went a little too far instead of and would have changed some things instead of simply cleaning up language. So we countered with some proposed changes to those parts that we did not agree with, but interior designers were not entirely on board with those. This is another example where having the legislative relationships really helped out the system. Jerry, I will hand it over to you.
So I would, for a point of historical reference, I think we have killed the various regulation possibilities for interior designers so many times that I've lost count of them. But, and so my immediate reaction when I saw this bill, thank you interior designers for sharing it with us, was, well, it's going to the business committee. So I believe we can kill it there. It's a great committee for me personally. And then I ran the traps. And so I talked to the members of the committee, and what I discovered was the chair of the committee and the ranking member of the committee were going to be the co-prime sponsor. So both parties represented in that group. And as I talked to other members of the committee, they said, well, you know, I think there's some room here for you guys to maneuver. And so I immediately went back to Mike and Nick and I said, hey guys, we cannot kill this bill in committee. We've got to figure out a way to make it as good as possible for architects. And we engaged in long negotiations. Nick was our negotiator and did an absolutely great job. It did help, I believe, that the chair of the committee was saying to the interior designers, you've got to get the architects to agree with you. So once you have that leverage, it's a lot easier to negotiate a compromise, and that's what happened.
Yeah, and one good takeaway that we can use in the future is kind of that recognition that when we say life safety amongst architects, we all know what life safety is. We all know why it's important to our profession. If you say life safety to a non-architect, you know, they're not looking at that same narrow definition that we're very comfortable with, that's code related, that's part of what we do. And so that's an important talking point every time, you know, when we see this in the future, is to kind of make sure that everyone's on board with, well, when we say life safety, why is that important to us? And what does that mean to us? And what might that mean to other groups? So yeah, I was pleased that we were able to come up with an agreeable set of amendments that put us into the neutral category on this one.
Thanks, Nick and Jerry. To send us out, Caleb and Nick are going to talk to us about Senate Bill 138. This is Consumer Protection and Construction Defect Time Period.
All right, so this bill introduced by my state senator, Robert Rodriguez, does three things. It would have increased the statutory limitation period for actions based on construction defects, or the statute of repose, from 6 years to 10 years. So basically, we could be sued for a longer duration after a project finishes. It also would have allowed the tolling of the limitation period on any statutory or equitable basis, and requires tolling of the limitation period until the claimant discovers not only some physical manifestation of construction defect, but also its cause. So this is a triple whammy of making it much easier for architects, engineers, contractors, subcontractors, everyone to get embroiled in more construction defect lawsuits when the playing field already isn't fair. Caleb, you want to talk a little bit more about what some of those terms mean?
Yeah, sure, Nick. So the statute of repose is what this really affects, and as Nick mentioned, statute of repose is pretty specific to construction defects, and it starts at a specific time. It can be this point of substantial completion of a project or something like that. States vary a lot from 4 years to 20 years on statute of repose, but basically the statute of limitations is out of effect after the statute of repose is done. So in Colorado, we have a 6-year statute of repose, so you can file a construction defect claim for that period of time plus an extension under certain circumstances. But after that point of time, you're out of luck. So we want that to be as limited as possible, because when you file a construction defect claim, it basically goes after everyone associated with the project. And then, so extending that would obviously allow for more claims. Tolling just basically puts a pause on that statute of repose. So for instance, Nick mentioned cause. If you find a construction defect, but you don't know the cause, and it takes you a year to find out what that cause is, it pauses that statute of repose. So it could go from 6 years to 7 years, or however long it takes you to find it. So it's just more time, gives everyone more time to file a defect claim. And so oppose.
So this was a bad bill. And our strategy was to kill it. And so when the bill came out of committee and went to the floor on second reading, we counted our votes. And you know, the cliche at the Capitol is, if you have 18 33-1, you can do anything at all. Well, the other side has to have 18 votes in the Senate as well. So I immediately met with the minority leadership, who controlled the 16 Republican votes. I reminded them that this was an ability for trial lawyers to get in the pocket of architects, that it was a bill that they have historically fought, and we needed their help again, and they committed. And then we added to that 5.5, I would say, committed no votes in the Senate. And each of those Democrats went to the sponsor of the bill and said, I'm going to be a no vote on your bill. So Senator Rodriguez, Nick's very own, every day put the bill on the second reading calendar and then laid it over until the next day. So every day I would run up to the balcony to listen to the third reading debate, the third reading debate. The second reading debate comes right after that, and they would get to this bill and he would lay it over. So it rose to the top of the list, and then COVID hit, and after it came back, after the legislature came back, he finally killed his own bill. But he did not have the votes, and I'm just here to tell you today, AIA killed that bill.
So
Right.
good to
Thank
end
you,
on a high
Jerry.
note.
Yeah. All right. So, Mike, are you ready to take us out?
Yeah, sure thing. Great format and great. There we go. Hi. Great information shared all the way around. Really appreciated the recap of the session. Brought some fond and anxious memories, depending on where we were on any given day. It was a great time had by all, and I hope that what our audience takes away from this is that AIA and architects are a player in the State House. We have been before, and we are an even bigger player today, thanks to, as Jerry said earlier, the team effort across the board from our member volunteers, the Government Affairs Committee, the Legislative Subcommittee, our staff, our lobbyists, anybody that's got a relationship with the legislator. It all goes together to make us a factor in these public policy conversations. And the other factor in that is we're the good guys. There's black hat folks and there's white hat folks, and we wear the white hat. There's usually nothing we ask for that if we changed our perspective and said, if we weren't representing architects and we're representing the public, would our position change? More often than not, it lines up exactly right because we do care about how the public is affected in the spaces we design and build. So that also helps from a legislative perspective to know that we're not out for any undue gain or to pull one over on anybody. Thanks for switching your hat, Jerry. I know you do like to wear the black hat sometimes. So just like the legislature, we hope that this conversation was also fast, friendly, and free. It was a good group to be sharing with us. And the other takeaway I had is you don't want to overplay your hand or be a nuisance, but you also don't want to be a stranger. So I think we were involved in just the right amount of issues this year that we should have been. We weren't taking positions on things that would lead to someone questioning, why do architects care about that? But we weren't absent on anything that affects our profession either. So it was a good mix, and it may be more than we've done in previous years, but the situation certainly called for it across the board. So that's, I had a question earlier, tried to follow up with JP on more specificity, but don't see that come through. If there aren't any questions or comments, there's no need to keep us any longer.
So could I make one last pitch, Mike?
Sure.
So we have this afternoon at 4 o'clock, a town hall meeting that Senator Chris Hansen, coming off a great primary victory last night, is hosting with 3 architects to talk about sustainability and strategies going forward. And Hanson, as I mentioned earlier, is a great friend of ours. We want to continue building that relationship with him. I hope that everybody on this call can tune in to the town hall meeting. And Nick, how would they get the link to that?
I am putting that in chat right now. Everyone can email me and I will send you the link that we got sent by Senator Hanson.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
That's great. Thank you for that reminder, Jerry. That's been a long time in the making, and we hope that it's the first of several that take place where architects partner with legislators to address their constituents on issues that not only the profession cares about, but their constituents can get involved in as well. So we'll be on the lookout for more of those opportunities, and hope today goes really well. Next Wednesday, if you'd like to tune in, we've got the Christopher Kelly Leadership Development Program is planning an introductory session. They are about to take applicants for the next class of CKLDP scholars. So if you'd like to know more about that, you can see that a week from today. Brandon, Doug, Caleb, Nick, Jerry, well done. Thank you. Not only for this session, but for everything that led up to the success so far. Appreciate it.